So here we're meaning to do something on um, a metaphor which will open some access, hopefully, to uh, thinkers and those who want to know what the methodos or path or vague of thinking is about, some closer access to. Um, I'm going to present a metaphor on how I'm thinking the distinction between the time of Immanuel Kant and uh, the system or thinking of Immanuel Kant on one side, that's both on one side, and as distinguished from the time of Martin Heidegger and the thinking that has the name, excuse me, Heidegger attached to it. Before I go into that, I want to mention that Guy Senstock was kind enough to invite me to a discussion, a dialogic discussion. I'm afraid I was probably talked too much and didn't listen carefully enough, so that this is bad for dialogic if this is meant to be truly the the coming together of minds, or two uh, speeches mixing together somehow. Um, that hasn't, of course, I'm anxious because that hasn't been released. I'm wondering how that will come out. But okay, so let's go on. I just mentioned that in interlude. But let's go on to look at this. Oh, I see. But what I wanted to say is also that in that discussion, um, I mentioned some things about Kantian autonomy over and against the Heideggerian Eigenlosigkeit, or what's being, it's somewhat confusing because we're interpreting this both as ownmost, which I think is more literal, Eigen, own, and then links directly to autos or autonomy, um, the which means in Kant the self-legislation of our own reason, to which unfolds spontaneously into our action. But also, this is being translated as authenticity. So, and this is somehow how it was attacked by um, Theodor Adorno, who wrote this famous book on the jargon of Eigenlosigkeit. Um, that has something to do with the notion that I think the simplest way to state it is this. Ordinarily, it would be stated something like, "Oh, if we're doing metaphysics, this is somehow seems to be against democracy, possibly because everyone in democracy is supposed to have their own thoughts and so forth, and the metaphysicians are few." But a simpler way to state that is that what Plato would say is, if something is good, if it's knowledge, um, conforming to it isn't a bad thing. So it's like, what are you, the question is only, what are you conforming to? Are you conforming to the truth? Are you conforming to something? Truth is a vague word in our time, but I guess let me do a brief thing on that. Is that I'll say Heidegger thinks of a concept which is very closely connected to the truth, which is agathos, or the good, and he presents it as the solid. So he gives the example of Heidegger, who was, I guess, a cross-country skier, and cross-country skied probably because of necessity, to get from one place to another, rather than skiing so much in the sense that we ski, quote unquote, for fun uh, these days. Although Sonny Bono killed himself on going off piste, but that is in an aside. Um, I would say that Heidegger gives the example for agathos, or the good, which is related to truth, as being soundness, and he says the board or the wood of a ski, that can give way, bend a little bit, but remain solid, is something which is agathos, or good, um, and therefore he calls into doubt the. This is perhaps a way, as Gadamer says, Heidegger is given quote unquote pedagogical exaggeration. So it's perhaps a way to say that we're alienated from the Greek understanding, and the way it looks to us is that moral truth and empirical truth are infinitely divided. So, like wisdom and knowledge about how things happen in a nihilistic way are infinitely um, uh, there's a schism between them that can never be repaired, stupendous schism. But that's his way of saying the Greeks are thinking something different, according to Gadamer, in a way. But we could say maybe that's true, okay. But I just want to give another view besides the Heideggerian view, which is on the good, so far it's connected to the true, is that agathos seems to mean, according to the classicists who present the correct view, let's say, the quote unquote correct view, and I think we shouldn't treat the correct view as anything mean. It's what things look like to people who really investigate them, who aren't, um, let's say, geniuses in a way. There could be a genius classicist, but they're not. That's a difficult subject matter. But if philosophy is taken for granted as the essence of the human thing, then the philosophers must be treated as higher. And then we would say, going away from the view that you get just from looking at the information or evidence, just from building up, just from making a forensic case, just from taking out of the text without reading our own um, thoughts in our own sort of, without hijacking the issue. Like we have to become sort of, by comparison to the classicist, is say Heidegger is like a gangster who hijacks the past and doesn't just read out of it, but sees himself in it too. So this is a long question about which position is higher. But from the position of the classicist, you'd say agathos, or the good, means something more like magnificent. So you see, even in a modest example, that an apple comes to full ripeness, there's something um, almost resplendent about that. You can see a little glitter on the surface of that apple or whatever. This is what good means somehow, and therefore it's closer to agathon, or it's closer to, excuse me, it's closer to the kalon, or to the beautiful, right? Like in, for instance, in the poetry of Sappho, for instance, you have these examples of, say, an army arrayed for battle. Some people will regard that as very beautiful, but you can see that at the same time, this was, or a better word, a higher word, is maybe that it will have a majestic, it will appear majestic somehow. And but at the same time, the army, the reason is partly because it's something like Heidegger says, it's a sound um, expression of the whole polis, as the polis which must be strong. So the soundness and the initial, let's say, quote unquote aesthetic, because if aesthetic has to do with emotions, it's not so clear. I would say it's impossible to say that the Greeks made exactly the same distinction between um, emotion and reason that we do. They didn't. For instance, I give you a recent work of scholarship, which is the book. It's called something like "From the Passions to Emotion," um, but the whole thing is very complex. How you sort out sort of impulses, hate, love, lust, hunger, etc., from reason, because obviously reason can be in accord with, for instance, if we have somebody committing some very heinous crime, it seems reasonable that people should be um, angry or even hate that person, in a sense, want them to be destroyed. It's hard to sort out, and the famous saying of Che Guevara, that I tremble indignation. Whoever trembles indignation at any injustice is a comrade of mine, which by which he means that, or one can infer that if you don't have this emotion of trembling indignation at the injustice, something's wrong with you. And we do think that in a way. We think somebody's a psychopath if they don't feel anything about some horrible crime going on, especially if they witness it at some proximity. Of course, with all kinds of attenuating notions, such as maybe there's a delayed reaction, maybe they're in shock, etc., etc. But essentially, it's very difficult to work that out. And then you get a doctrine of interest, such as in Hobbes, who says, when so far as reason is against a man, man will be against reason. But then you have to work out, what does it mean against, and the question of who really loves reason, who really is just there for, is being accused right now of Republicans, that they're only out for the so-called raw political power, and perhaps we're threatened with degenerating into a banana republic and so forth. But so on all these issues, we have this problem of how does all these issues appear in Kant's time? How do they appear to Kant himself? How do they appear in Heidegger's time? How do they appear to Heidegger himself? In general, I give a reference to Jacob Burckhardt, who Heidegger credits as being not just a historian, but a thinker of history. If somebody wants to look further into what is meant by these, what are the forces that obtain in a certain time? What's it like in ordinary life? What's it like for the daily life of the time at different times? Burckhardt has opened up the subject matter one can say, under the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche, even though Friedrich Nietzsche was a younger man and Burckhardt was somewhat older. So the metaphor I was giving, which is somewhat playful, was thinking of, was of the film Chinatown, with Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway and John Huston. We're thinking in the Kantian time. Say we're in the Kantian time. Let's make an analogy of the Kantian time to the actual film Chinatown. So there's a scene where Jack Nicholson comes to speak to John Huston, but the Jack Nicholson character, let's say, comes to speak to the John Huston character, who's a kind of old land mogul in southern SoCal in the 30s or so, and there was historically some issues with the water, which I believe were fictionalized for the Chinatown, but he's basically like a guy who's like a land baron. I guess land baron is a better term than mogul. He wanted total political power, and you could say in a Socratic sense, he didn't care if anybody knew that he had the power. In fact, he would prefer that nobody knew he had the power. He just enjoyed the power for its own sake. So take this whole situation where Jack Nicholson comes to visit the John Huston land baron, and the land baron saying something along the lines of, I hope you don't mind, but I believe the fish should be served with the head still on. And Nicholson replies something like, as long as that's fine with me, as long as you don't serve the chicken like that, or something like that. And there's a scene, and it's like the gaping fish with the eyeball and all that. But behind the scenes, so let's say here's the second part of the analogy. Behind the scenes, what was going on is Jack Nicholson in real life had been dating Angelica Huston, the daughter of John Huston, and so Angelica Huston would then be analogous to the Faye Dunaway character, who was the daughter of this land mogul, played by John Huston. All this is very difficult to keep in mind unless you actually take a look at the film, but I'm assuming most people have seen the film, or even if they haven't, it's probably worthy of seeing. I can't quite say that Heidegger would appreciate it. Maybe he would. Maybe he would regard it as mere entertainment. He was known to praise Rashomon, the film Rashomon, very highly. Not sure how many other films he commented on. But if you think of the situation behind the film with this tension between Jack Nicholson, Angelica Houston, and the father of Angelica Houston, John Houston, it has a mirror in the film because the tension is between the character Jack Nicholson plays, the detective, and Faye Dunaway, who's the daughter of the land mogul, and John Huston, who's playing the land mogul, and there's dialogue which brings that out. So this whole situation of this strange, the silver screen, the film, the films, the film stills, and so on, has mirrored in what was happening in real life and has the interchange of the two. I think this is the situation a thinker is in who tries to think the Kantian time and the Kantian system over against Heidegger's, let's say, changed terms, such as Heidegger modified terms. So, how did the terms modify? How did they translate when thought by Heidegger, but not just when thought by Heidegger? Heidegger taken as the name for a philosophy rather than the biographical Heidegger, but also Heidegger time, the whole time he lived in. The times are totally different for everyone, not just for the individual, not just for Kant, who wrote around the year 1800, and Heidegger, who wrote around the year 19. I suppose the middle of his life, the end of his life was, he died around 1976. So we're talking 150-year difference here or more. It's very difficult if we start now, and we're already glancing back to Heidegger, and we're already, some of our time is already flowing into Heidegger. Some of Heidegger's thinking is connecting in this concept of Eigenlichkeit or Ohnmostness, or the spontaneous source of their thinking, to the Kantian time where we're thinking about autonomy, which is meant to be the innermost freedom, which you could say in a transformed and slightly accidental way becomes the absolute in Hegel.